Well, we're coming to you from Pomona Elementary School, and the reason we're coming to you from this location is that this is where I grew up. I grew up going to this elementary school several years here, have great memories here. I had some good teachers, although when you're a kid, do you really care whether your teachers are any good? You just remember things about them, don't you? Like Mrs. Brown. I'll never forget Mrs. Brown. I'm sure she was a great teacher, but she was a chronic smoker. Now, at that time, nobody really said much about what that did to your health and that kind of thing. But I can tell you that whenever I was called up to her desk and had to have a close encounter with her, my toenails curled. If I could have given her a lifetime supply of certs, I would have done it. That would have been a great time for social distancing. I wish that rule had been in effect when I was in Mrs. Brown's class. Again, a great teacher, I'm sure. She had no idea how devastating it was to be called up. She would say, Steve, come up to my desk. And I'd look at the kids next to me and I would say, I think she called you. And we'd all argue, who did she call up there? Because we don't want to go up there. Then there was Mrs. Grable. Mrs. Grable was great. She was short, had red hair. I think she was Irish, but she was married to a German guy, staunchly strict German guy. She drove around to Trans Am, and they lived in English Gardens, so they fell victim to our doorbell ditch 'em game throughout the summer months. Only we were afraid to go to Mr. Grable's house. He would come out with a gun. We were told it was a salt gun, not a assault rifle, but a salt gun, whatever that is. But he scared us to death, so it took a lot of guts to do that. Anyway, those are some of my teachers, but we are here to study the greatest teacher ever. And by now you know he's much more than just a great teacher, right? And we'll get into that. We're in a series that we're calling The Father's Business, and it has to do with what Jesus said to his parents when he was 12 years old. From this point on, I'll be solely focused on doing my Father's will. And so we've been studying the book of Luke because the book of Luke gives us a pretty good picture of what doing the business of the Father is really all about. And so that's where we've been, that's where we are still, and we've inserted an idea out of Hebrews chapter 12 where Jesus is called the pioneer of our faith. Now, what is a pioneer? We don't know what pioneers are like today, do we? Or do we? Is it possible to be a pioneer today? Or are we just kind of all going to be settlers? We've talked a lot about that. We'll talk about that again today. If you weren't with us last week, let me pick the story up. Jesus referred to the children in the marketplace or in the neighborhoods, and he said they tend to play games like spoiled children, wondering why people won't play games with them. And he was accusing the Jewish leaders of doing that very thing. So we talked about that last week. And I told you that that's pretty common in our culture, amongst the leaders of our culture, especially during this shutdown, right? This virus shutdown. It's pretty common for politicians, for celebrities to play games. They expect one behavior from the rest of us, and they play a different game. I've got to tell you, I ran across this. The mayor of Chicago is a gal by the name of Lightfoot, all right? I think it's Lori Lightfoot. Anyway, she told her constituents, she told the people of Chicago, we're shutting everything down, and if you leave your homes, she threatened them, she said, we'll arrest you, you'll go to jail. And then she said these exact words. I think this is so much fun. She said, we're not playing games. Well, that went over okay, I guess, until she snuck out and had her hair done at her beautician's place. And when she was asked about that, she said simply, well, I take my hygiene personally. Very important to me. As though nobody else does. Anyway, that's what we've been talking about in the last week. Playing games, and we understand the culture lives that way. But are we supposed to live that way in the church? And that's what we discussed last week. Now, speaking of games, the games on that grass field, and it was much bigger when I was a kid, not just because I imagined it, but because some of those buildings were not there. Our football games were legendary. Legendary. I could not wait until recess. I could not wait until I was last to be picked to be put on a football team. But some of my favorite games in elementary school were inside the classroom. Do you remember these? If you're old enough, you remember these. Remember Heads Up, 7 Up, and Simon Says? Simon Says is a great game, right? It's where you can't do something unless Simon tells you can do it. And if you do it without him telling you to do it, whoever the leader is, Simon, then you're out of the game. That's important because today we're going to hear from a guy named Simon who was used to people doing what he told them to do. Jesus is actually going to go to his house. And that's the context of where we're going today in Luke chapter 7. Okay, so the context of what happens here in Luke chapter 7 is that Jesus has been invited to a Pharisee's house, and the Pharisee's name is Simon, all right? And this is an amazing moment in the life of Jesus, which is redundant, I know. Amazing moments in the life of Jesus was all there was. But it's another amazing moment, and the text is actually going to start with the word behold. You might not have that in your translation, but it starts with behold, meaning now pay attention to what just is about to happen, Luke writes. We're going to break this text into 3 parts. The parts, we'll call each one of them, have a name for each part. The first one is going to be called tears. The second one will be called jeers, and the third one will be called cheers. All right, here we go. Luke chapter 7, starting in verse 36. Behold, one of the Pharisees asked Jesus to have dinner with him, so Jesus went to his house and sat down to eat. Actually, he reclined. In those days, they didn't sit on chairs to eat. There was a short table, and they would recline on one elbow with some pillows. That way, their feet would stay away from the person next to them. The common understanding was that they had walked in the desert. They had dust on their feet, and they would try to keep their feet from the face of the person next to them. So that picture of the Lord's Supper that's so common, where they're all sitting on stools on one side of the table. Sorry, I hate to break the news to you, but it just didn't happen that way. So Jesus is reclining at the table along with others to eat. And verse 37 says, and a certain immoral woman, read prostitute, from that city heard he was eating there, so she brought a beautiful alabaster jar filled with expensive perfume. Now, some really important details there. Any bottle that was made of alabaster, you knew that it was of incredible value. Alabaster was a stone that was quarried only in Egypt, and so they wouldn't just put like milk in that. They would put incredibly expensive perfume. She brings that. She knows Jesus. She hears Jesus is going to be at this guy's house, and she walks in. It may have been in the evening, maybe some not candlelit, sounds like a romantic dinner, some torches maybe on the walls, but she was not immediately recognized, or she would never have gotten past the front door. Okay, we pick it up, verse 38. Then she knelt behind him at his feet. Okay, he's reclined. She knelt behind him at his feet, and she began weeping. The word here for weeping is the word for rain. I mean, she began to rain tears down on Jesus. Isn't this something else? Her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them off with her hair. And why would she do that? We're going to find out later that this Pharisee did not have someone wash the feet of the guests. Jesus' feet were not washed. That was the common protocol when you had someone come to your house. So she looks down and she begins to just weep and rain tears down, and it's hitting her feet and hitting his feet and turning it to mud because his feet were still dirty. So she lets her hair down, which again, women in that day and age would not do. She lets her hair down and she begins to wipe his feet with her hair, as if to say, I can't believe someone didn't wash his feet. I will wash his feet with my tears, wipe them with my hair. Then she kept kissing his feet and putting the perfume on them. Okay, the word kissing. I know there's a lot of details here, but it's so important to this amazing story. She's kissing his feet. She wipes him with her tears, kisses. The word kiss here is an intimate, passionate word that was used when Jesus told the story of the prodigal son. When the father finally saw the son returning and ran out to meet him, he kissed him. That's the same word that's used. He is so overwhelmed with joy that he kisses his son. That is what's going on here. And so if you get the scene, this is a scene of tears, and that's significant. Now, let's talk for just a second about this guy named Simon. Again, we pretty much bash the Pharisees a lot on this program, don't we? But you need to know that Simon is a guy you'd want to hang out with, all right? He was really smart, went to Harvard. He was wealthy. These guys were very wealthy. They always voted for the elephant. They were very conservative. He was a nice guy. I've told you this before. We tend to say the word Pharisee, and we see it then in a black hat. He's wearing a white hat. Everybody wanted to be the Pharisees' friends. Everybody wanted to know Simon. He's upstanding in the community. So, what a privilege. And boy, I can tell you, he did not realize who this woman was when she walked through. But in a moment, he's going to recognize who she is. And he's aghast that somehow she's gotten into his house, because no self-respecting Pharisee would allow this to happen. So what is happening here is scandalous, all right? This upstanding citizen of the community has a prostitute walk into his dinner party, all right? Make sure you understand that before we move on in Luke chapter 7. We've seen the tears, here come the jeers. Verse 39, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, didn't say this out loud, said this to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of a woman is touching him. She's a sinner. Okay, he thinks that. Then Jesus answered his thoughts. Simon, he said to the Pharisee, I have something to tell you. Go ahead, teacher, replied Simon. Then Jesus told him this story. A man loaned 2 people some money, 500 pieces of silver to one and 50 pieces of silver to the other. But neither of them could repay him, so he kindly forgave them both, canceling their debts. Who do you suppose loved him more after that? That's the question to Simon. One guy is in debt 500 pieces of silver, other 50 pieces of silver. He forgives their debt, they can't pay it. Who do you think loves him more? Simon, and you can read between the lines here, rolls his eyes and says, I suppose the one for whom he canceled the larger debt. And Jesus said, you got it. That's right. Now, don't miss out on the unspoken things going on here, all right? Really important to understand, Simon is not happy about having to answer this question. You know what a prima donna is? Have you ever heard that phrase? If you look up in the dictionary, prima donna, there's 2 definitions. The first one is the lady, the main character who is a woman at the opera, who is the headliner, all right? Have you ever heard the phrase, it ain't over till the fat lady sings? That's who it's talking about. The fat lady, and again, it's just, I'm not making that up and disparaging anyone about their exercise routines or anything like that, but she tends to be the big lady who runs the show with the opera, and she has the last song, then it's finally over, okay? That's a prima donna. The second definition of the prima donna is somebody who the dictionary says is a temperamental person with an inflated view of themselves. All right, look at Simon. He is jeering. In his mind, at least, he's jeering what's going on. He is a prima donna. He has an overinflated view of himself, that he is so much greater that he can actually look at her and call her a sinner and totally disregard any sin on his own behalf. Okay? Really important that you understand that. He is the fat lady. All right? Again, understand it for what it is. It's just a phrase that means, the show revolves around this one person, and this was Simon's show, and he believed this will go until I say it's over and I'm in charge. All of a sudden, the tables are turned on him, and things have just gotten a little ugly. I mentioned to you before that I transferred from a college in the Midwest to a college in Southern California where I graduated, and in between I spent a semester as a para in an elementary school such as this. And we had one young girl, I think we were in 2nd, 3rd grade, something like that, and she was just the cutest little girl, all red hair, freckles all over the place, and she would come up to my desk and she put her chin in her hands and she just stare into my face. And one day she said, Mr. Shaw, I said, yes, Tracy. She said, you have a big gulp. And I said, what do you mean a big gulp? This was before big gulps, by the way. And she said, you have a big gulp. I said, what do you mean, Tracy? And she pointed right here to my Adam's apple. She goes, you have a big gulp. Well, what's about to happen, if you were there, if I were there, we are about to see the big gulp in Simon's throat get even bigger. All right? There's going to become a lump in his throat when what happens is about to happen. Luke chapter 7, verse 44, we're going to call this the cheers. Okay? Then Jesus turned to the woman and said to Simon, isn't that interesting? He looks at the woman, but he's still talking to Simon. This is very theatrical, and Simon knows it. Look at this woman, he says to Simon. He's obviously not talking to the woman now, but he's looking at her. Look at this woman kneeling here. When I entered your home, you didn't offer me water to wash the dust from my feet, but she has washed them with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't greet me with a kiss, but from the time I first came in, she has not stopped kissing my feet. You neglected the courtesy of olive oil to anoint my head, but she has anointed my feet with rare perfume. I tell you, her sins, and they are many, Jesus says. I'm not overlooking the kind of life she has lived. They are many, have been forgiven. So she has shown me much love. But a person who is forgiven little shows only little love. Then Jesus said to the woman, so he's never stopped looking at her, but he's talked about her. Now he's continuing to look at her, and he says to her, your sins are forgiven. Can you imagine the life she has led, the life she knows what she deserves? You are forgiven by the Son of God. Verse 49, the men at the table said amongst themselves, who is this guy? Who is this man that he goes around forgiving sins? These, I'm sure, were friends of Simon. Verse 50, and it winds up this way, and Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Okay, so we've seen the three parts of this story. We've seen the tears, we've seen the jeers, and we've seen the cheers. What Jesus just did was to cheer her on as a human being. I believe in you. I forgive you. Have peace in your life from this point on. Okay, now let's talk about the players, and let's start with the host of this party, with Simon. We're going to call this Simon Says, because what he says in his mind is what's really important. All right? If there's a way to describe him, as I mentioned in the last segment, it is that he's a prima donna. All right? He is the one who has an overinflated view of himself. So as the prima donna, what's interesting is that he didn't even really say anything, but he gets called out for what he thinks. I don't know how that makes you feel. That scares me to death. I mean, I say a lot of things I shouldn't say. I know I do. My wife reminds me of that. I say a lot of things that I regret. I can't even imagine if I was fully aware that Jesus always knows what I think. If my words get me in trouble sometimes, my thoughts would really, really get me in trouble. So what's happened here? Who is this Simon? Again, he's well respected in the community. Everybody loves him. I'm reminded of the story of the little boy who was outside the vet office with his dog. And a woman came up, and they're waiting for the vet's office to open, and she just wanted to make a conversation with the little boy. And so she looked down at him, and she said, "Are you here to see, Dr. Thompson, the veterinarian?" And the little boy looked up at her, and he's holding onto his dog with a leash, and he says, "Yes," he said, "I am." He said, "I'm here to have my dog put in neutral." You can be sure that Simon is not neutral. The Pharisees were not neutral concerning Jesus. They had already decided that they wanted to get rid of him, that they despised him. Having Jesus come to his house was not for the purpose of just learning and understanding and getting to know Jesus better. He was there to be critical of him and to scrutinize him. That's what you need to know. He was going to scrutinize every word he said, and he was going to be critical of everything he did. And that's what's happening in this moment. That's why in his mind he says, this guy can't be a prophet. I've already decided there's no way he's a prophet, because a prophet would know that this woman is a sinner, and a prophet, a godly man, would never be touched by a sinful woman. And this was before the coronavirus. So that's what he's sure of. Here's the problem this Simon has, and it's twofold. Number one, he thinks he knows Jesus, and he doesn't. He thinks he knows Jesus, and he doesn't. And number two, he thinks others have sinned, and he is not. Now, apply that. Is it possible that I go through all the rigmarole, all the religious, traditional things to show people that I'm a righteous person, that I'm a person of God, that I care about the things of God, but I don't really even know Jesus? Do you know Jesus? What do you know about him? And secondly, if you don't know Jesus, there's a great chance that you're not even aware that even though you're sure of everybody else's sin, that you're not even sure of your own sin. And so unless we want to fall into the trap that Simon fell into, maybe we need to rethink our position, as he is the first major player in this scenario, and it gets ugly for him right away. So Simon is not about knowing Jesus. He doesn't want to know Jesus. That's not what's foremost on his mind. He wants to scrutinize Jesus. He wants to criticize Jesus. And he's also sure of one other thing, that everybody else sins, and he can really pick out the real sinners, but he avoids any sin in his own life. So when it comes to playing poker with Jesus, what Simon finds out is that Jesus always has a royal flush, and Simon has a pair of twos, and you never win. You never win when you play this game with Jesus. Bottom line, Simon was about criticizing and scrutinizing Jesus. So the obvious question is, how often do I find myself in the role of a prima donna? Always criticizing others, scrutinizing others, and possibly even criticizing God and scrutinizing God as though he needs to answer to me for his timing, for how he does what he does, why he does what he does. Can you relate to Simon? Well, here we are at the Museum of the Mountain West, and if you've never been out here, it's pretty amazing. I would hope you'd spend some time out here, because if you're from this area or you're new to this area, there's a whole lot out there that's just fun to see and experience. Right next door is the Carriage Work Building, and it was upstairs in the Carriage Work Building where Jack Dempsey came in 1912 and trained. Now, to some of you that name means nothing, and I get that, but Jack Dempsey in 1919 became the heavyweight champion of the world. He kept that status as heavyweight champion until 1926, and it all began in the building next door upstairs. Isn't that amazing? But I want to tell you about this setting right here. This bar is pretty significant. It was brought down from Telluride, and it was in Telluride in the late 1800s, mid 1800s. And while there, I can tell you that somebody pretty notorious probably ordered drinks from this very bar. You see, it was in June 24th of 1889 that Butch Cassidy pulled off his first bank robbery in Telluride at the San Miguel Valley Bank. Now, you have to go back 5 years earlier to know that it's then that he came into Telluride, and he worked there in the mines around Telluride, and he worked at a ranch. In fact, a little known fact, you realize that Butch Cassidy was arrested for stealing a horse, and he was tried right here in Montrose during that time. So he was here 5 years earlier in Telluride, then he went away for a time, and he came back in 1889 to rob his first bank. But the reality is there's a great chance that he spent time at this very bar. Now, why are we here? Great question. The next person that we want to focus on in this scenario that we're describing and is described for us in Luke chapter 7 is what I want to call the pioneer woman. The pioneer woman. Now, I don't want you to confuse this pioneer woman with Anne Marie, as she goes by Ree, Drummond. That's the pioneer woman that we know of in this day. If you turn on television and you'll see her do her show out in the plains of Oklahoma, she's become very famous. Well, who I want to talk about is what I'm going to call the original pioneer woman. Now, why do I call her the pioneer woman? Again, this metaphor we've been using, that we have a choice in life, whether to be pioneers or settlers. But the pioneers were people, and today are people, who are willing to go out and blaze a new trail and take risks. I ran across this meme of a sign outside of a field. It was on a barbed wire fence, and the sign said, "Do not cross this field." It said that in big bold letters, "Do not cross this field." And then underneath in smaller letters it said, "Unless you can do it in 10 seconds, because the bull can run it in 9 seconds." Isn't that great? Is taking a risk about running away from bulls or jumping off the sides of mountains or jumping out of totally good airplanes? Well, I want to use the word in connection with the pioneer woman that we're talking about today, the word passion. If Simon was a prima donna, this woman, and we don't know her name, this woman was a woman of passion, and taking risks is part of being a pioneer. And I don't know if you appreciate how great the risk was that she took. It was unbelievable. She had to know that there was about a 99.9% chance that she would be thrown out of Simon's house on her head. And yet, she did it anyway. So what does passion look like? You know, we talk a lot about passion. We think we see it in certain people who are passionate about the sport they play or the hobby that they have, whatever the case may be. Many people are passionate about their families. But this woman was so passionate, and you see it in what she did. Again, the risk she was willing to take. And I would go so far as to say that if you want to be a pioneer, it cannot be done without risk. Incredible risk involved. But if we were to really try to encapsulate this idea of passion, what does it look like? I think she was selfless. Selfless. You cannot be a pioneer without being selfless. If I am so concerned about how everything affects me, chances are I'm going to settle into a life that's very comfortable, that's very convenient. Aren't you? How inconvenient was this for her? How uncomfortable must it have been? This was an unselfish thing she did as she stood at the feet of Jesus, looked down, dropped to her knees, and began to weep. Why? Because she was thinking just to herself? You know what she was seeing? She was seeing the contrast between her and Jesus. That's what she was seeing. She knew the truth about herself, and she now, just by looking at him, knew the truth about who he was, and it melted her. As the scripture says, she rained tears. Isn't that unbelievable? She then took this very expensive bottle and she anoints his feet. She makes them smell good. She does for him what this supposed good guy was not willing to do, but she did it at her own cost, with her own tears, with the idea that she will be scrutinized and she will probably be thrown out. Which leads us kind of to the sacrifice. Unbelievable sacrifice. Her willingness to say, no matter what comes to me, this is going to be about you, Jesus. If you want to be a pioneer, if you say that's the life for me, I don't want to be a settler. I don't want to be just like everybody else. You know, we're here in these surroundings because at that time there were a lot of pioneers. This bar was built and put in Telluride by people who had pioneered out into the mountains and through the rocky terrain. And for her, for this woman, the original, to me, pioneer woman, made incredible sacrifice, was willing to do that. If you and I say we want to be pioneers, you're going to have to be selfless, to be willing to sacrifice. So my question would be, so what are you willing to sacrifice on behalf of Jesus? All this in the midst of, in spite of the fact that she was an incredibly sinful person.
See, it's so easy to look back into God's Word and make heroes of all these people, and she truly, to me, is a hero. But she's a hero in spite of her sinfulness. And we can't become like Simon, who ignored his own sinfulness and only saw sin in other people, only saw lacking in other people. He did not see his own, but she was absolutely confident. She knew she was a sinful person. And Jesus confirmed it by saying, and her sin is great. I love that about Jesus. He didn't pretend, hey, she's basically good. She's a great gal. That's not the truth. The truth is we're all sinful, right? That's really essential to all this. What I love about this is that if we want to be settlers, if we want to be religious, like Simon, we will hide our sin. But if we want to be pioneers, if we want to be real, like this woman, it teaches us that we need not fear what our sin will do in the presence of Jesus. He can deal with it. The bottom line is this. She simply wanted to know him. She simply wanted to know him. And she would go to any lengths. We talked about the fact that most of us, if we're honest, are a lot like Simon, aren't we? Very critical, scrutinizing what other people do, even scrutinizing God, questioning him about everything he does or doesn't do. But this woman, the pioneer woman, was all about knowing Jesus. She would do anything to know him. Does that sound like you? Does it sound like me? So we've talked about two of the three players in this scenario. Now we come to love defined. We come to the third person, the most important person in this scenario, the one that makes it all happen, and that is the perfect. The perfect, Jesus. I want to make that point. I think we skip over that point. As I said in the beginning, I was talking about my teachers at Pomona Elementary. How, as far as I know, they were good teachers. I mean, I can read today, pretty much. So that's good. But I want to talk about not just someone who was the greatest teacher ever, not someone who was just a great prophet. When we talk about Jesus, when we talk about who they called Yeshua, we are talking about the perfect. All right? And to understand that, I don't want to gloss over. I want to read several scriptures that verifies that he was without sin. The Bible tells us in the book of Romans that we're all with sin. We all have missed the mark, missed the bullseye, missed the target when it comes to being who God asked us to be, being who God created us to be, doing what God pleases God all the time. But not Yeshua, not Jesus, not the perfect. Here we go. Hebrews chapter 12. We're going to just run through these. Verses 1 and 2. Let us run with endurance the race God has set before us. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and perfects our faith. He did what we want to do. He did it perfectly. 1 Peter 2:22. He committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. In other words, every time he opened his mouth, there was nothing but the truth that came out. He never committed a sin. Hebrews 4:15. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin. Every temptation you have ever encountered, every possible opportunity I've ever had to sin, he had it, and he never sinned. And finally, 1 John 3:5. You know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. So when we talk about Jesus, we can't just assume that people know. We're talking about the perfect. Okay, so the third person in this setting that we're talking about, that Luke wrote about in Luke chapter 7, is the perfect, is Jesus. And he defines love. He didn't just love. He defines love for us. In fact, I want to challenge you. I want to challenge you to never again define love without using the word Jesus, without using the name Jesus. He defined it. If you want to know what love is, look at Jesus. And that means all the very kind and generous, encouraging things he said to people, and it includes all the very challenging things, like he said to Simon. That's what love looks like. He defined love. And he pointed love out to us. And that's what he does in this scenario. Remember what he said? She loved much. She loves me much. What is he saying? He's saying, if you want to know how to love, look at her. This sinful woman, this woman with a dark past, this woman of the night, this woman from the oldest profession known to man, she knows how to love. Again, I take you back. What is it she did? It was with passion that she was selfless and that she sacrificed. It took risk and it took the willingness to go without. So when you look at anything that stands before you, any situation, any possible interaction with people, any opportunity, my question to you is this: do you look at it in the sense of, oh, how do I feel about it? Or are you able, like this woman, to put yourself aside and say, I focus purely on the perfect one? And it is what he wants. It is what he desires. I will say what he wants me to say. That's what Jesus is saying about this woman. Incredibly selfless, incredibly sacrificial in how she approached this setting. So the question becomes, what does or what would passion look like in my life? Can you ask that of yourself? Do people see passion in me? And again, it's not just about emotion. There's certainly emotion involved, but it's about the will. I will to be unselfish. I will to be sacrificial. And I will have a plan on how to fulfill what pleases the Father. When one looks up the definition of passion in the dictionary, you'll find a couple things, but inevitably, if you look up passion, oftentimes it includes the name Jesus. Jesus is known throughout history as one of passion. And it was a passionate thing that his Father did in sending him. It was a risky thing that he did in sending his Son, because he knew the world would, by and large, reject his Son. He knew that he would have to be separated from his Son, that his Son would take on our sins. Jesus points to this woman and says, she loved much. Every time Jesus used the word love in association with her, it's the word agape. We've talked about that. That's not a sensual love. It's not just a friendship love or brotherly love. It is a selfless, sacrificial, I'll put you first love. And Jesus pointed to her and said, she did it. She did it. Not the religious guy, not the good guy, not the conservative, not the one everybody wants to be like. This woman, even with her past. Now, this is not the only time this kind of scenario played itself out. In the last week of Jesus' life, Jesus has come back to Jerusalem, and in an outskirts of Jerusalem, there's a little village called Bethany. And I'm going to read this to you because it sounds like the same story, but it's not the same story. We pick it up in Matthew chapter 26, verse 6. Meanwhile, Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon, a man who had previously had leprosy. So Jesus had healed him of leprosy. By the way, he didn't tell him, stay home, stay safe. Anyway, while he was eating, a woman came in with a beautiful alabaster jar of expensive perfume and poured it over his head. Does that sound familiar to you? This first woman we're talking about is a pioneer. She blazed the trail. I don't think these women even knew each other. But she began this trend. Experts believe that this happened at least twice, maybe 3 times, at the very least, in Jesus' life. Verse 8, the disciples were indignant when they saw this. What a waste, they said. In the other parallel context of this, we know that it's Judas who kept the money box, right? And of course, he thinks it's a waste because he wants that money for himself. They said, what a waste. It could have been given, that kind of a thing, it could have been sold for a high price and given to the poor. And Jesus responds, why are you criticizing this woman? Remember what we said about Simon? Jesus now says it about his own disciples. Why is it that you are about criticism? Why are you scrutinizing this woman, he says, for doing such a good thing to me? You will always have the poor among you. Is that true? Do we still have the poor amongst us? That's come true. But you will not always have me. She has poured this perfume on me to prepare my body for the burial. And then he makes this prophetic statement, I tell you the truth. As long as the gospel is preached, they will speak of what this woman has done. Guess what? We're 2,000 years later, we're still sharing the gospel. I just shared it with you a moment ago, right? God sacrificially, very riskily gave his son so that we could have eternal life. We're still preaching the gospel. That's the great news. We're still talking about this woman. Jesus' prophecy has come true even 2,000 years later. Amazing. Now the question becomes, am I more prone to criticism and to being cynical about people and about God? Or am I known more as a selfless, sacrificial person? That's the two options in this story. Now let's get back to what Jesus said about this woman. He ends it with saying, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now wait a minute, Steve. I thought we were saved by grace. Yes, it is grace. It is God's grace, which is a gift given to us, to gives us the opportunity to know him. To know him. And that's salvation. According to John 17:3, when Jesus is praying, he says salvation is that they know the Father and the Son. He doesn't speak of heaven. He doesn't speak of playing harps forever. He speaks of knowing God. The opportunity was a gift of grace to us to take advantage of that opportunity. And this opportunity was given to this woman, and she trusted. That's faith. She trusted that Jesus, no matter what everybody else said, would take care of her. And he says, salvation has come to you because of your trusting nature in myself, in my Father, is what he says. That is passion. The willingness to take the risk and to trust that God will take care of all the details. You know, I was reading an author just the other day that made a statement that I've always believed, but I've never heard anybody say it. This guy's an author and a well-known speaker, teaches God's word, and he said very candidly, he said, I, most of the time, am scared to death to do this, to speak on behalf of God. Number one, he said, I obviously will face criticism, which comes with the territory. But he said, number two, and this one scares him the most, and I totally relate, he said, there is a decent chance that I could misspeak for God, that I could say something that doesn't truly represent God. And I totally relate to that. There's a great chance. I make mistakes. I'm human. But then he went on to say, but to not speak on behalf of God, I can't live with. And then he quoted Jeremiah. Now, I don't know if you remember what Jeremiah said, the prophet. He said, I don't want to speak for God anymore. But if I don't, he says, it begins to burn within my bones, and I have to speak of God. It is an incredible risk. It is an incredible risk to write, to speak on behalf of God, to speak to others for God. But it's a risk we must take, and we must be passionate about it. Do people see us in the church as passionate people, or are we settlers? Are we just kind of plodding through life day by day, like Simon? I just want people to like me. I just want to be, known by a lot of people, respected by people. Passion is a risky thing. It's a very risky thing this woman did. And so we began to look at our own lives and say, am I willing to stop saying, well, how do I feel about this, whatever this is? How do I want to approach it? What do I like? And we transform into a person by the power of God who says, what does God think of it? What is God doing? What does God want me to do? What does God want me to say? That's a huge change in who we are. Faith brings us to knowing Jesus, and that is salvation. And it's as though Jesus was looking at Simon, the prima donna, saying, you had the same opportunity. You had the same opportunity. You could have known me. Instead, you chose to sit back and smugly criticize and scrutinize everything I do. And this woman comes, and her only goal is to know me. That could have been you. Would he say that of us as well? When I came out here to this museum and I talked to what I believe is the curator of this museum, he said, and I told him what I wanted to do. He said, you'll probably want the chapel. And he showed me into the chapel. And I've been in that chapel before, and it's very cool. It, I think, was built here in 1913 in Montrose. I think it was a Lutheran church building. And but then he mentioned other buildings, and I looked in here and I thought, this is perfect. Because the truth of the matter is, Jesus spent as much time with people in places like this than he did in church buildings. Many years ago, we were doing youth ministry in Tucson, and it was a typical Sunday morning. You know, we had quite a few kids packed into a fairly large room, and I saw a kid walk in, and just the sight of him scared me to death. I'll be honest with you. He sat on the back row, and he folded his arms. His head was shaven, he had a white t-shirt on and baggy jeans, and he just stood there and scowled. Then he sat down, and a couple of my youth staff guys who were college age, they said, do you know that guy? And I go, no. And the way I said it was kind of like, and I think we need to get him out of here. You know, he may shoot the place up, I don't know. They said, we'll take care of it. So I thought they were going to go like usher him out and say, hey, this isn't really a setting for, you know. Instead, they went over and befriended him. They sat down with him. They found out that he is a gangster. And he had stolen property, I think, from a school. And they said that community service could include sitting in a gathering like that, coming to church. So he was doing community service. He had no intentions of meeting Jesus. Long story short, John came to know Jesus. John reminds me of this woman. It was pretty risky of John to walk into that setting. But he came to know Jesus, and he went on several mission trips with us, and I will never forget on a few of them, he would look at some of our other youth staff people. We had a couple gals that were, 3 or 4 gals that were college age, and they honestly kind of had a propensity towards selfishness, you know, making selfish decisions, talking about themselves. And John would confront them, and I've never forgotten this. John would look at them and in the most serious tone say, you know what? He called them by name. This isn't you, and this isn't the world. And that's how he would say it. And I couldn't have said it better. What he was saying is, you know what? I've come to know Jesus, and the first thing I know about it is it's time to put ourselves aside. It's time to do that. That's the pioneer. That's the pioneer. That's the pioneer woman. That's what Jesus called us to. Put ourselves aside. Get focused on the perfect one. Make our lives absolutely all about that. Quit caring that people are going to criticize us, scrutinize us. Quit trying to be an upstanding citizen and just focus on Jesus and do what he asks us to do. I pray that this story affects you like it's affected me. I think it's an amazing moment, certainly in the life of Jesus, but again, that's redundant. It is an amazing moment in this pioneer woman's life. May you experience many of those amazing moments.